Hi, everyone. Welcome to Big Blend Radio's Way Back When History Show with Nancy and Lisa. You know, we're the mother-daughter travel team on the Love Your Parks tour, and we're publishers of various digital Big Blend magazines, including we've got a brand new one, Way Back When Histories, coming out soon. So keep up with us at bigblendmagazines.com for that and sign up for our newsletter. But today we're excited to welcome author and attorney Charles Oldham. He is based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, and we love North Carolina. We've traveled all around the state, down the coastline, through the countryside. We've, stayed on farms. We've stayed in bed and breakfasts. We've just had it's an amazing, beautiful state, but it has quite a diverse history, and some of it is a little turbulent. And so we're really glad to have him on the show today to talk about his latest book, and it is called Ship of Blood. But he's also the author of the award-winning book, The Senator's Son. And you can get both books if you go to beachglassbooks.com. You can go to beachglassbooks.com/books/Ship of Blood. But welcome to the show, Charles. How are you?
I'm doing fine, and thank you so much for having me.
We're loving this because I think what you're doing so well. Number one, you're a fantastic author, and you're telling this is a true story, right? And yet it reads like a novel, like, you know what I mean? And I think that's a really important thing for those of us who aren't, kind of the nuts and bolts people with every little fact, and you get the story over really well. What led you to start writing?
Well, I am, like you mentioned, I'm an attorney by trade, and when I was still practicing, most of my practice was focused on criminal defense work and some civil litigation too, but criminal defense was what I liked most. And I always thought that this is the primary reason why I went to law school, was because people always told me growing up that I was a pretty good writer. And I had some stories in the back of my mind that I thought really needed to have some attention, because no one had ever focused on them and written complete accounts of them before. That's what I did with my first book, The Senator's Son. But I reached a point where I made a commitment to myself, and I said, I'm going to take whatever amount of time I need to away from my law practice, and I'm going to put in the weekends, and I'm going to put in the holidays and do the research to write this first book. And that's what I did with the Senator's Son, which we published in 2018. And it went well enough that I got to a point where I was willing to make the commitment to start writing full time. So that's what I'm doing now.
Wow, wow, good for you. I don't know what it is, but all you lawyers and your writing is like, in fact, we have a employment law expert on our show, is attorney Ward Heinrichs, and he's writing a fantasy novel. I'm like, what's going on? But he said, listen, if you can't write, you can't be a good lawyer, and the devil is in the details, and you have to be able to write the best letters. And so there's something in that with, I don't know how many attorneys we've interviewed who have written books, and they're some of the best books you can read. And I think what you're doing is so great, because you're telling stories that may have been brushed over. Ship of Blood, it did get turned into a movie. Apparently you didn't like that movie so well.
Well, there was one film version of it that was produced back in the 1950s. And I don't want to sound like my opinion is the end all and be all, but to be candid with you, that movie back in the 1950s did not do well at all. It did not appeal to the audiences, and the critics didn't like it either. And I think maybe one reason for that is because the filmmakers, they butchered the story completely. What they put together was just not faithful at all to the events that actually happened. And I think the end result was that it was just the film that they put together was a little too silly and overwrought, and it didn't appeal to the audiences. So,
and this is something really that when it happened, it was a really big deal, right? And it wasn't just a night and day case, but so when something gets a little crazy in Hollywood, that can really personally hurt people, so I think that's also a good reason.
This is such a great story. I mean, it's amazing. I don't think it needs to be messed with, I don't think Hollywood needed to jazz it up at all.
I agree.
Yeah. So, but that, that was quite a while ago when it was in Hollywood. Maybe today, they would do a much better job of it.
Well, I think it could be done. Yes.
Yeah. We need
Well,
Steven Spielberg.
yeah, or Oliver North. Yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know. We might have to have Quentin Tarantino on this one. I don't know.
Oh,
That'd be a little crazy. But
yeah.
let's get to the story so people, because they're all probably going, "What are you talking about? What are you talking about?" So tell us, kind of set up the scene. I mean, this was what, in the 1800s, and so the North Carolina coast, as I recall, we've driven up and down South Carolina, North Carolina, and you've got lighthouses. It seems that there was a lot of stuff went on, and in pirates, right? And you have pirates and shipwrecks, and so this was like a transport carrier, right? A carrier thing for lumber and all kinds of goods.
Yeah, that's true. The case happened in 1905, so just over 100 years ago. And if you're familiar with the North Carolina coast now, I mean, it's mostly beaches and hotels and vacation homes and that type of thing. More than 100 years ago, very little of that. And what we were dealing with in this case was, like you said, it was a commercial sailing vessel that was shipping a load of lumber. It departed from Mobile, Alabama, and it was traveling to Philadelphia. The ship was called the Harry Burwind, and there were 8 people on board this ship. 4 of them were officers, and 4 of them were what I call lower decks sailors. Total of 8 men on board the ship. And this became a North Carolina case really just by chance because of location. Because as it turned out, there was a multiple murder and a mutiny that took place on board the vessel, and it happened just off the coast of North Carolina as the ship was traveling north. And the vessel was intercepted by another ship that came along and found them off the coast of North Carolina. They noticed that the vessel was sailing erratically and it seemed to be out of control. And so the people on board this other vessel boarded the Harry A. Burwind. And what they found was that there were only 3 people out of those 8 remaining alive on board the ship. The 4 officers had all been shot to death and their bodies had been tossed overboard. One of the 4 lower deck sailors was lying dead on the deck of the ship, and there were only 3 guys remaining. And one of them had been tied up. He had the other 2 guys had assaulted him and tied him down and tied him hand and foot. And the other 2 guys were still walking around on the vessel. But there were 3 people who survived, and they started telling different stories about what happened and who did what. And so that was the source of all the drama and also the murder trials that came later.
And so this was also a case of white versus black, because the survivors were black, right? They were African American.
Correct. The 4 officers who were killed were all white, and the 4 lower decks sailors were all of African descent.
Wow.
So what they ended up with was a murder trial, which was held in federal court in Wilmington, North Carolina, which was the closest major city to where this all happened. So these 3 black guys were put on trial for murdering the 4 white officers. And this was in, as I said, it was in Wilmington, North Carolina in the early 1900s, in the very darkest days of the Jim Crow period.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wow.
So
that
when
didn't
that
go over
happens,
well.
yeah, and what I find interesting is that they all have different stories. And
Yeah.
is that something that you found even, as a practicing attorney in criminal defense and criminal law, that happens? Is it a natural thing, or is this something that just out of fear? How does that happen where everybody just suddenly has different stories?
Well, it's completely typical. I mean, when you've got a crime scene like that, and you've got 3 or 4 or more people implicated in what happened, then of course their stories are going to vary because they're going to blame each other. And then of course the challenge is to sort through all the stories and compare them with the factual details and the forensic details that you can gather from the crime scene and try to figure out, as they say, who done it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's not unusual at all in a case like this. But as it turned out, in this trial that proceeded in Wilmington, there were 2 different stories. The 2 guys, two of the fellows told one story, and they were remarkably consistent in the stories that they told. Whereas the third guy, the one who had been tied down and incapacitated on the ship, he was telling a completely different story. So the stories were basically 2 versus 1. And but all 3 of them were put on trial for the same crime, the murders. And so they ended up testifying against each other, and they were telling stories that were 180 degrees different from each other. So,
Wow.
but at the same time, given the setting in Wilmington, North Carolina, again, due to the racial issue involved, you had a situation where all of the jurors in both of the trials were white. And so there was a natural inclination to tend to believe that these black guys probably were all in it together, and they must have all been guilty to some extent. That was the natural tendency. But what really surprised me was that even though the people involved in the trial, despite their natural inclinations and their prejudices, they actually listened to the testimony. And the newspapers in Wilmington actually did the same thing, and they did so with somewhat of an open mind, which surprised me. And they started to really listen to what these guys were saying, and they concluded that 2 of these guys probably were telling the truth and they were not involved, whereas the one who was telling the other story probably was culpable for the murders. So
Wow. So, when you think about the justice system, because we, tend to get up in arms on different things. And we just had actually a conversation with a judge, a retired judge in North Carolina. And he was explaining, he says, even all the way up to the Supreme Court, he goes, people take an oath that are in the judicial system, as lawyers, as judges, there is, and, at the end of the day, it will come out in the wash. Even if a trial gets bounced around, sometimes it gets bounced around for a reason or to a different place. We were actually talking about Texas more, what was going on with Texas and women's rights in Texas. And, he was just saying that there is honesty in the judicial system. Obviously, there's always going to be, a bad apple somewhere, right? In anything. But it seems like that at the end of the day, it can prevail, right? Do you feel that way?
Well, justice can prevail, but you have to work at it. And you have, especially if you're a defendant in a murder case, you really have to have advocates who know the law well and who are in there, going to the mat and fighting for your rights, which of course any ethical attorney is supposed to do. And another thing that surprised me a lot about this case in Wilmington was that the attorneys who were appointed to represent these guys, these black guys on trial, these defense attorneys were white, as you might imagine, because they were part of the economic, power class in the city at the time. And in fact, some of them had actually taken part in what was known as the Wilmington Insurrection of 1898, which I go into in the book. It was a really, really horrific event where there was a white supremacist mob that essentially took control of the city government in 1898, and it was a violent coup d'état. Is really the best thing you can call it. But that happened in 1898, and about 60 people were killed. In fact, they were shot dead in the streets. And that happened just a few years before this trial occurred.
Wow, that's amazing when you think about it, huh?
Yeah, but these white defense attorneys, they actually did their job, and they represented these African-American clients whom they've been appointed to represent. And as I said, it did turn out later that one of them really was guilty, and not to give too much away, but they were all sentenced to death at first. And one of them, in all likelihood, really deserved it, and he should have been hanged because he killed 5 people, and he did. His death sentence was carried out. But the other 2 guys, the newspapers and a lot of other people in Wilmington, even white people whom you would never expect to show any sympathy to them, but they did, and they eventually took the case to the Supreme Court, and they took the case to the White House for presidential clemency proceedings, and they took it to Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the time, and eventually those guys got out of prison, if you can believe it.
Wow.
About 6 or 7 years later.
That's quite amazing for that time in history for
amazing.
that to happen. That really is. Yeah, they're lucky.
It When I came across the story,
Hmm.
really it was just by accident. I found out about it from a historical review article that was written back in 2014 that just summarized the details of the case. And like I said, I just came across that by chance. And when I did, I couldn't believe that I had never heard of this case before.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, I having grown up in North Carolina, spent my whole life here, practiced law here, and yet I've never heard of the case. And like I said, I was just struck by simply the details of how the legal case went. It really is. It's really astounding that it could have turned out that way.
Do you think the movie that was made, you usually when there's a movie made, especially with this kind of story, people pretty much know the story. But if the movie's really bad and it's not accurate, and maybe, I don't know how much harm the movie actually might have done, to keep this maybe something people just wanted to forget.
Well, that's a possibility. Maybe that might have discouraged another filmmaker who might have come along later to look more deeply into the case. But one thing I can say is that up until that point, when the movie was made in the 1950s, no one had gone back and written a faithful, authenticated, full account of the historical events. And there have been a couple of magazine articles written in detective magazines back in the 1930s that were based on it somewhat.
Oh, wow.
But they didn't. Again, they were not really faithful to what really happened in the case, and I think that's primarily what the movie was based on. So,
yeah,
maybe too many details for people. I think those are, if it's not an open
or not enough,
not an easy case, that there's so much to it that people kind of shy away maybe on that too. I mean, so you're pretty much the first person to write the full account.
Yes.
Of from start to finish. So did you do a lot of research, going to museums, going to the coast? Is there any part of the ship even left anywhere?
Well, I mean, the ship, as you might imagine, no longer exists. In fact, the ship it actually sank, or it ran aground off the coast of Cuba about a year after this happened. So it no longer exists, obviously. And as of course, all the people who were involved are long deceased by now. I was fortunate, though, in that, and this is primarily because it was a federal court case, the documents were all still there. They are in the National Archives in a couple of different facilities, and I was
that's cool.
Able to find those, and that was really neat because they preserved not only the trial transcripts but all the exhibits from the trials. For example, the log book from the ship itself. So I can actually admit through that I saw the captain's handwriting of how he was documenting everything that happened on board the ship up until the time of the murders, which was interesting.
Yeah.
And all the court documents, letters, all of that's still there. In the actual handwriting of the defendants, which is really,
because you have images through the book, you've got clippings, it's really amazing. It makes it so real, that it's this history that's there, but like pretty much buried. Is there any contact with any of the family for the gentlemen that were released?
Well, that's I had some trouble with that, frankly, because it's hard to document exactly where they went after this was over. Again, not to give too much of it away, but the two guys who were released from prison, it's hard to tell where they went after that. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to track down their.
I would have bailed over the border somewhere. I would have been like, enough of this, So
I can't say that I know really what happened with them after they were released from prison. One of the captain of the ship, his descendants are still around, and they have remained visible, and they've maintained their ancestors' legacy, and they've made some comments to the newspapers from time to time when there have been retrospective stories published about the case. So I had their views on it as well. But one thing I noticed, and I was a little disappointed by this, but in Wilmington specifically, I found almost no one who had any recollection of the case at all.
Are
Wow.
you kidding me?
That is
Wow.
it's no,
That's
it's true,
weird.
and it surprised me a little bit, and it's probably because even though the trial was held in Wilmington, really it's just by chance that it was in Wilmington, and neither the defendants nor the victims had families who lived there. Everybody
Oh,
was from
okay.
away, so there are not any family members still around. But even apart from that, I was really surprised that a case with such an astounding and remarkable outcome has been forgotten. And yeah, I
So
speculate a
not
little
even
bit.
the local
Like
museums don't
historic
even have
markers or
no historic markers, nothing in the museums.
Nothing, not a thing.
wow.
And
That's amazing.
even
Wow.
even in Wilmington history books that have been written since over the past 20 years or so. And that 20-year
Wow.
mark is significant because it's really just within the past 20 or 25 years that historians have started to focus on the Wilmington insurrection and the events of 1898. And that history
Huh.
has gotten a lot of overdue attention in the past 20 years. But despite all that, nothing about this case. And that really surprised me a lot.
Yeah, that's kind of, that's just odd. It's like
Especially when they
maybe
did the right
nobody
thing.
wanted to, maybe they just wanted to keep it quiet.
Well, that may be. And I'm sure that was the case for a long time. I mean, through the whole segregation era, which
Right.
went up through the 1960s, and some would say even beyond. But it's really surprising to me that just since within the past 20 years, when everybody has been talking about the Wilmington insurrection and the injustice that was involved in that, and they've been putting up monuments all over the place and having commemorations, and books have been written and authors have given talks about it and so forth, just almost nonstop for the past 20 years. And yet nobody seems to remember this case, which had such a remarkable outcome, and which was such a surprising example of justice prevailing despite all the racial tensions at the time. And yet this is the first book about it.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's incredible because I think, just it's a good example of what the justice system is about. It's a positive thing, and also including the newspapers in that. I think that's also very important, where it goes on the facts, ma'am, nothing but the facts, ma'am. You know what I mean? I think that's also something huge. And you look at even now, I mean, you look at the case that just happened in Brunswick, Georgia, just over the border. I think that was some positive, things are turning. But it's important to keep the positive out there to show that this could be the way.
And that is why I wrote this book, because I wanted this to be a positive story that people could draw upon. And I wanted people to look at this case as an example of how justice could prevail, even in the very worst of times. And I mean, these were the worst of times. There's no dispute about that. But it was just very surprising that so many people in Wilmington were willing to look at the facts, and they were willing to give these guys a chance and actually go to the mat for them and seek justice on their behalf. So,
do you think there was a lot of difference between, once you've got 4 black guys and you got 4 white guys all on this boat that isn't that large, the ship, really? It's kind of surprising that it's 4 and 4. Do you think that they got along, or did they really just from day one, things started to ferment, because it just seems odd. It's like all the whites on top and all the blacks in the hole, or that kind of thing.
Well, that arrangement was not unusual on commercial vessels of that day. I mean, the shipping companies, as you might imagine, were owned by primarily commercial outfits that were based in the North, say Philadelphia, New York, and that type of thing. And so the officers tended to be white, and they hired crews who were, in many cases, African American from the South or from the Caribbean. In fact, three of the sailors in this case were from the West Indies, and they were of African descent, but by way of the Caribbean islands. But as to whether there was already tension aboard the ship, I mean, I know there was, because it was documented in the ship's log.
Mhm.
The captain was making notes about how some of the black guys were making a fuss about how the conditions on board the ship were not good, and they were being treated badly because of their race and so forth, which is entirely believable, because I can certainly imagine that there was racial tension. And I mean, the working conditions on board the ships were really nasty. I mean, even under the best circumstances, because they were hauling coal and they were hauling lumber.
Yeah,
before before mechanization, and they were sailing down to Cuba and to Alabama, and at the heat of summer, doing all that strenuous work. I mean, tensions are going to be high. So so it's not surprising at all that there was tension, but it usually didn't lead to murder,
right.
which is what happened in this case. And I don't want to give too much away, but I'll leave it at this. I mean, it's pretty clear that the one sailor who I believe really did commit the murders, he was in all likelihood just a narcissistic, psychopathic personality, and he brought guns on board the ship, and he was probably out to hurt people from the beginning.
Oh wow. That, just being stuck on a smaller ship under those circumstances, day in and day out, and it's not like you can call a cab and go.
No, listen, there's sharks overboard. Can I just say there's the fear of sharks? I mean, to me, anytime I hear about stuff going on a boat, I'm like, dude, what's on the other side, and it could either be really freezing cold, or you're going to get your ankle bitten off or more. You know what I mean?
Well, and then
so
just killing somebody and toss them overboard. I mean, it's not like people are going to be able to find evidence. Like once you're overboard, you're overboard.
I wonder how many murders happened on ships, like where it just was like, you know what, I've had enough of you overboard, and that's that. And you just kind of keep sailing on. And I wonder if, because of the resources way back when, if they were able to trace what would happen to someone. I think it could have been easy to just take one person, throw him overboard, and move forward and say, oh no, he fell.
I wouldn't doubt that it happened more often than we realize.
Yeah.
Like you say, it wouldn't be a difficult thing.
Yeah. Wow.
I often think about the slave ships, of how brutal that had to have been on such, epic journeys. Not epic like it's exciting, and I mean those are monster long journeys coming from Africa and all in the Caribbean even, but just to be underground like that, to be at the bottom, the claustrophobia alone could totally, I mean, it's just and you think about it, the timing wasn't that far away, right? When you think about it.
Well, it was roughly 40 years after the Civil War ended.
Yeah, it's not that long.
Yeah, and it was just after the Reconstruction period was concluding. So the war, slavery were still very much within living memory by that time.
Yeah, exactly. Going through all the documentation, did you kind of feel like a private investigator, like reading people's handwriting? And I mean, did you, when you talked about the handwriting, is that something that you read? Because people don't like, therapists read handwriting, and people like investigators to see personalities.
Yeah, I mean, that's not really my skill set, but it's fascinating just to go through and see the different types of handwriting and the way that people expressed themselves back then. It's it's different, and it takes a bit of interpretation to what people meant.
Yeah, it's like trying to read Shakespeare for the first time. It's like, what do you mean?
Would you like to see the movie remade and done properly?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that should be done. I would love to have a film made based on my book. I think that would be a wonderful thing.
Yeah,
well done. That's it.
I would say that, wouldn't I?
Yeah, of course.
You should.
Well, I'm just interested because like there's in the film there were women, of course, and I'm trying to figure out where I guess maybe they're crying on the shore as the ship leaves, and then they're yay when the ship comes back. I don't know, and then the aftermath of finding bodies.
Yeah.
Because they weren't on the ship, I wouldn't imagine.
That's true. There were no there were no women on board the ship. Although in the movie they had to add one. But
was she a cook?
despite that, I mean, the narrative is fascinating enough that I think it's possible to make a very, very interesting film based on the actual.
I
Documentary.
think so too. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
even a documentary film, those
Definitely that. Yeah.
that, the History Channel or BBC
Mhm.
does, and PBS do some really, amazing pieces. So it'd be great, I think.
Mhm.
And, kudos to you to, digging
Yeah.
up these stories, and following through on, like you said, you made this commitment to do it and to write. Give us a little background on The Senator's Son for those who
Yeah.
have not read it. Tell us a little bit about that, because we
Okay.
haven't read it yet either.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's another true crime story that occurred in eastern North Carolina. Just by chance, it happened in the very same year, 1905.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
And it's about a very mysterious disappearance of a young child, a young boy who was 8 years old at the time. His name was Kenneth Beasley. And the way this happened was that he wandered away from this little 2-room schoolhouse that he attended in rural North Carolina. It was at a recess at school one day, and he wandered back into the woods behind the schoolhouse. It was if you knew the area, you could picture this really well, but it's a very swampy.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
Area.
By the
So
Alligator National Wildlife Refuge area?
not too far from there, actually.
Oh, uh-oh.
Yeah.
But anyway, the boy went missing in the woods,
Wow.
and as you might imagine, all of the neighbors gathered together and they started searching through the woods, even during the night, picking through the swamps,
Wow.
and trying to locate him, but they couldn't find him. It seemed like he just disappeared off the face of the earth.
Wow.
But the really interesting thing is that this young boy, and again, Kenneth was his name, but his father was the state senator who represented that area in the North Carolina state legislature at the time. And once he went missing, there were rumors that he had been kidnapped by a man who had a political grudge against the boy's father.
Wow.
Because it turned out that the senator was very involved in the anti-liquor movement, prohibition movement at the time.
Oh.
And this fellow who had the grudge against him was a well-known local bootlegger.
Oh.
Even though this other fellow had political connections of his own, because his brother-in-law was a former governor of North Carolina. So it was this big mystery, and it went on for about a year and a half, with the rumors flying all over the place, but no resolution being taken until a year and a half later, in or I should say late 1906, charges were finally filed against this man. His name was Joshua Harrison. He was brought to trial for kidnapping the boy. So again, many rumors, and it turned into a big political drama in that part of North Carolina. And it harkens back to the same issues that I cover in Ship of Blood, because the prohibition movement at the time was very tightly wound up with the white supremacy movement at the same time, because the issues kind of interplayed with each other. I can tell you, it's still a mystery as of now, because they never found the child, even though there was a verdict in the case.
Wow.
But in going through all the facts that I could find, I think I figured out what happened.
Ooh.
Alligator. No.
Not that.
That was the first thing that went through
alligator.
my head. Okay, don't blame the animals.
Wow.
But that's crazy, because North Carolina really was like the home of bootlegging, and then North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and I mean, even think now, I mean, Daytona races came from bootleggers. I mean, that NASCAR, I should say, not
These
Daytona,
are some pretty exciting stories. I think you better go knock on Hollywood's door.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So are you working on another one? Is this like are you getting into is this like North Carolina true crime, historic true crime?
Yeah.
I've got a couple of ideas that I'm bouncing around. I'd like to expand a bit. I'd like to do something that's not as locally based, something that might have a bit more of a nationwide appeal. So I think there will be a third book, but I haven't decided on exactly what direction I'm going in with it.
Okay, so in Louisiana, in a town called, outside DeRidder, it's in DeRidder Parish, it's DeRidder, there is a Gothic jail. It is the only
Yeah,
Gothic
it's
jail in the
creepy.
country, and it's one of the creepiest places I've ever
It's
been
so
to.
creepy.
And it's haunted, presumably. And back then in those jails, the jail family, the jail warden and his family would actually live in the jails, which I think is a whole other, because you go in the basement and it's Gothic.
Yes.
I mean, it looks like this Victorian kind of mansion.
It's
And
got
then
a
you go in and
spiral
it's like,
staircase.
it's just like a, yeah, it's like
creepy.
going inside a lighthouse, the way the spiral staircase is, and the cells are on the outside. They had one for the women, but the women misbehaved and would take their clothes off and show themselves out the windows. So then they put a cage within a cage to cage the women up. I mean, it was it was crazy. But there were two guys, and it made headlines for it. These two teenagers robbed a cab driver. And in doing so, when the cab driver fought back, they killed him, pushed him and the cab into a swamp. And then they ran off with the money. They got caught and hanged in this prison. And this was a big deal. Now the town comes up. And whenever I talk about lynchings and hangings, people did come out with their picnic baskets and
their
watch
kids.
these things. It's not
with their kids. It was like a party.
This was the town event. So they came out, and apparently when they hanged them, they marched. You could see it in the noose, and like they have a makeshift noose now of exactly where it was, which is freaky. And I swear that somebody's hand was on my head when I was walking up the stairs. I just saying. But they actually took them out on stretchers, the dead bodies, through the crowds. Out of the door.
Crazy.
But this story to this day is still blowing my mind about just two young guys and a cab driver all over like $20 or something. And it just, this whole court case. And
as you enter the ground floor of the jail, to the right, you see the spiral staircase, and you look straight up and the noose is just hanging there. So that is where they hung them. So it's just like you walk in the front door and there'd be a body.
Yeah, you got to go to Louisiana.
Yeah, that's a pretty good story.
Louisiana's, because they had the no man's land when there was no law and order after the Louisiana Purchase for 3 years. This one strip, the neutral strip, nothing, like all the pirates gathered up there, and it's just cool. So I don't know, go to Louisiana. This swampy stuff is always good. It's like the going on the coast. I mean, there's this intrigue of, people being in those ships and those boats is just, it's mind-blowing what human beings have done in the past. And now here we are, controlling ships by Wi-Fi.
Nothing about that surprises me. It's entirely believable that they would have handled the case that way back then.
Yeah, but
that's crazy.
I think they were white kids. And it's like, that's it. And but man, but you've got to have seen a bit of everything in your law career. Is it better typing it out instead of being on the courtroom floor?
Yes, I prefer writing books as opposed to actually practicing. I mean, I'm glad I did practice law for, let's see, it was about 15 years. I did that because it gave me the skill set, and it gave me enough experience to know what I'm writing about.
Right.
Having done that, I'm having filled my head with the experience, I enjoy writing books more.
Well, you're good at it.
That's
sure.
Cool. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
I can't wait for everyone to hear this and to finish the book too. It's like, I love it when true stories get to have their due without it being too glossy, but when it reads like a novel where you can get into it, that's a true talent. So that's awesome. I want to give everyone, again, it's Charles Oldham. And you can go to beachglassbooks.com, which is, you always want to go to the publisher's website or the author's website. And that's the place to go to purchase the book. Obviously, all the other places as well. But we always want to promote the publishers directly. It's, let's keep small businesses going.
Yes.
So beachglassbooks.com/books/ship of blood. If you just go type in Charles Oldham on the website, you'll find him there too. And of course, keep up with us at bigblendradio.com. And thank you so much for joining us. It's been a true good discussion.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.